Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sermon Supplementals with me, Pastor Tom. In each new episode, we will explore a biblical idea based on the previous Sunday's Gospel reading. This week, I'm coming to you each day with an insightful exploration of the events of that day in Holy Week timeline according to Mark's chronology. In this episode, we are concentrating on the events of Holy Wednesday and in particular about his failed disciples. For us, Lent is a transformative journey in time, from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday. For the writer of the Gospel of Mark, Lent is a transformative journey from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem. During that journey, Jesus tried to prepare his disciples for what would happen to him when he demonstrated against the Roman imperial power concerning its violence and against Jewish high priestly authority concerning its injustice. And more importantly, Jesus attempted to prepare them for their individual and communal participation in the death and resurrection. But as we shall see, Peter, James, and John and the disciples as a group, and finally Judas, all failed tragically, and except Judas, not irrevocably, to accept their destiny alongside Jesus. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, the writer could not emphasize enough one point about this very, very prominent theme. The story of failed discipleship is his warning gift to all who ever hear or read of his narrative. We must think of Lent today as a penitential season because we know that, like those first disciples, we would like to avoid the implications of this journey with Jesus. We would like its Holy Week conclusion to be about the interior rather than the exterior life, about heaven rather than earth, about the future rather than the present, and above all else, about religion safely and securely quarantined from politics. Confronting violent political power and unjust religious collaboration is dangerous in most times and in most places, first century and 21st century alike. Here, then, is how Mark's warning builds up negatively toward the first person who positively believed Jesus' message, that unnamed woman with her eternal alabaster jar of ointment. So very early in his gospel, Mark records that Jesus went up the mountain and called to him those who he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the message. So he appointed the 12. That's from the 3rd chapter. But there is an interesting ambiguity in Mark's account of that group's relationship with Jesus. On the one hand, they are regularly taken aside for special instructions. In chapter 9, verse 28, for an example, when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately about their inability to exorcise a demon. And in chapter 10, Jesus takes them in the house and answered the question the disciples had concerning issues of divorce. In chapter 4, Mark has it that this group seems at least fleetingly larger than the group of 12 disciples. It says, when he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. On the one hand, this special and separate instruction seems to be a dismal failure. It seems as if anything to increase their failure and even their responsibility for it is maybe the point of Mark's inclusion. Thus, Mark records of the disciples that their hearts were hardened in chapter 6, as Jesus scolds them with this battery of accusatory questions. Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? All of that is in chapter 8. And on the other hand, it is just Jesus' genuine attempt to instruct them and to prepare for the death and resurrection that he was about to go, and their eventual destiny in sharing the same cup that he must endure. So for general background, to be part of the 12 in Mark's story is to fail Jesus badly. And all of that becomes very, very specific on their own Lenten journey with Jesus from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem. Mark focuses the failed discipleship of the 12 around 3 prophetic warnings of his death and resurrection given to them by Jesus. Mark's Lenten journey starts in Caesarea Philippi in the very far north of modern-day Israel. It was then the capital of King Herod Philip's territory, in a venue as Gentile as it was Jewish. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, but far from applauding him, Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Such injunctions to silence in Mark usually do not mean you have it right, but keep it a secret, but rather you have it wrong, so keep it quiet. In other words, please shut up. Peter and the others may well have been imagining Jesus as a militant Messiah who would free Israel from the Roman oppression using violent means, and it was that notion that Jesus wanted to discourage. But right after that wrong and silenced misunderstanding about Jesus as Messiah comes that correct and open announcement of Jesus as Son of Man. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. That was found in chapter 8. Jesus names himself as Son of Man, and that title would be repeated in the second and third prophecies concerning his execution and the resurrection that Jesus gives to the 12 disciples. And it links all 3. That title comes to its climactic use in the trial scene in late chapter 14, and we will discuss it more fully in our next episode. All 3 connected prophecies of death and resurrection begat at least incomprehension, if not downright opposition from the 12 disciples. The first one, in chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, generates complete dismissal, as Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And Jesus' response is equally blunt. But turning, looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." The word Satan is a Greek word that means simply obstructor. This is the same word that is used to describe the purpose of the angels who get in the way of Balaam and his donkey in the book of Numbers. In other words, Jesus is forcefully telling his disciples to get out of my way, do not obstruct my destiny. At first blush, you could be forgiven for mistaking that Jesus called Peter Satan, but upon closer readings, you notice Mark includes all the disciples and not just Peter when he rebukes them as Satans. Mark is making clear that all of the disciples, and in a sense, all of us can be obstructors to God's ultimate plans. In chapter 8 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus details what is at stake for those who want to follow him. Jesus says, if anyone want to become my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. If those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? It is extremely important to underline Mark's theology at this point. For him, Jesus knows in precise detail what is going to happen. Peter, the other disciples, and the crowd are all expected to walk with Jesus toward death and resurrection. To follow Jesus means to accept the cross, to walk with him against imperial violence and religious collaboration, and to pass through death to resurrection. The second prophecy on his death and resurrection that Jesus gives to his disciples emphasizes his foreknowledge and his disciples' utter failure. Mark wrote in chapter 9 of his gospel, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He does not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, 'The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed he will rise again.'" Mark has Jesus pass southward through Galilee without any distraction in order to concentrate completely on the disciples. And this time, those who would kill Jesus are mentioned only as human hands, but death is mentioned twice. Does Jesus now succeed with the disciples at this time? Well, according to Mark, no. In fact, he writes in chapter 9, "Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you arguing about on the way?' But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, 'Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all.'" Even as Jesus is announcing his death by execution, they are debating precedence among themselves. Here Mark is not only criticizing the disciples, he is almost lampooning them. And as we see in the next instance, they completely ignore Jesus' admonition about becoming first of all by being the servant of all. And he has to say it all over again. The failure to understand what must happen in Jerusalem must have felt like a gut punch to Jesus. This is the final climactic and most detailed of Mark's three false prophecies. The third prophecy, it continues with what we have called the Lenten journey theme, as Jesus tries in vain not only to foretell his destiny, but to explain to his disciples that particular destiny, so that the disciples may be enabled to follow him all the way through death to the resurrected life. And once again, climactically, they are going to fail dismally in their response. Here is the text from chapter 10. They were on the road, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was happening to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." Notice that rather strange opening. It continues, of course, this journey theme that is represented by movement from Caesarea Philippi through Galilee to Jerusalem. Remember, the Greek word translated road can also be translated more symbolically as way. They were all on the way, or at least supposedly they were supposed to be on the way to death and resurrection. Next, recall how Mark had opened the challenge by following Jesus to everyone, and not just to the 12 disciples. After the first of 3 prophecies in chapter 8, this theme is repeated here, and not too subtly. Jesus is walking ahead, and those who followed him were afraid. That is the proper response, since Jesus has challenged them to follow him to death and resurrection. When then Jesus took the 12 aside, Mark emphasizes again that they are not the only ones involved on this journey. These 3 prophecies emphasize that Jesus is calling all of his followers, and not just the 12 disciples, to accept that destiny of death and resurrection. And of course, as we have already seen discussing the 2 symbolic demonstrations on Sunday and Monday of this week, that confrontation between Jesus and the various forces of this world is against the oppressive foreign empire and its collaborative local religion. And that is to say, the forces that Jesus fought was against any religio-political combination that tried to establish injustice on the earth that belongs to Yahweh, the God of justice. Finally, after each prophecy, however, Mark reports an absolute failure by the 12 disciples, and these failures are as repetitively significant as Jesus' prophecies. Then their utter lack of understanding about Jesus' fate and their own eventual fate was exposed in an episode with the unnamed woman with the alabaster jar. During the beginning of chapter 14 of Mark, a woman enters the house of a Simon the leper and begins anointing Jesus by putting ointment, costly ointment, on his head. Mark reports that this ointment was extremely expensive to purchase and it required a year's worth of wages. Yet the amazing part of the story is not the audacity of this woman walking into a seemingly stranger's house, nor is it her, without getting permission, dumping all the ointment on Jesus' head, or that she spent that much money on ointment. In fact, it's what Jesus says at the end of this peculiar episode that makes this story stand out. Jesus says in chapter 14, verse 9, "Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." When the preceding verse is read against the continuous criticism of the 12 that I have been noting, the significance of her action becomes clear. Jesus says, "She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial." She alone, of all those who heard Jesus' 3 prophecies of his death and resurrection, believed him and drew the obvious conclusion. "Since you are going to die and rise, I must anoint you now beforehand, because I will never have a chance to do it afterwards," she thought. She is for Mark the first believer. She is for us the first Christian, and she believed from the word of Jesus before any discovery of an empty tomb. Furthermore, her action was a graphic demonstration of the paradoxical leadership cited by Jesus for himself and all of his followers on the model of servant and slave. Recall those parallel texts from Jesus' second and third responses given previously. They serve as preparation for this scene. The unnamed woman is not only the first believer, but she's also the first model. Instead of being placed at the head of everybody, she is important because she served. Jesus has been telling the 12 what disciple leadership entails from Caesarea in the far north of Israel all the way down to Jerusalem, and has gotten nowhere with them. But this unnamed woman believed him, and presumably Mark locates her among those others beside the disciples who have been accompanying him on the way. Mark writes in chapter 15, "There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and they were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem." She was both one of those many other women and the first and only one who believed what Jesus had been telling them repeatedly. Hence, that supreme and unique praise for her as the first believer and a model leader. Mark's inclusion of this unique story makes clear his intention. The unnamed woman represents the perfect disciple leader and is contrasted with Judas, who represents the worst of all possible leadership. And now go in peace and serve the poor.